preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I'm Deborah Seymour, Associate Director of the Charles Simon Center for Adult Life and Learning at the 92nd Street Y. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation, 21st Century Architecture, Knitting Together the Old and the New. Our guest this evening is truly accomplished in the field of architecture. David Schwarz founded his architectural firm in 1978, and he is Director of Design at his firm. The firm's philosophy and design intent is a direct outgrowth of Mr. Schwartz's personal commitment to architecture of buildings as places for the people who use and experience them. David Schwarz is committed to the teaching of architecture and has taught on the university level and lectured to the public as well. He has lectured extensively on knitting together the old and the new, the reintroduction of scale and detail to architecture, and the return to an architecture as places for people. He has had speaking engagements at, among numerous other locations, the Smithsonian Institute, the National Building Museum, Yale University, and the University of Maryland. Mr. Schwarz has received a multitude of awards for his architectural work, and his design work has been featured in a variety of architectural and general purpose publications. Tonight's format will be as follows. Mr. Schwarz will make his presentation and speak for approximately 45 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of questions and answers from the audience. And now, please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Mr. David Schwarz.
Good evening. First of all, please call me David. I'm not used to being called Mr. Schwarz. That was my father, and he's now dead. So, but please, when you address any questions to me, call me David. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and it's a real pleasure to come and chat with you. I have to tell you, this is the first time I've ever spoken from a stage, and it's really quite odd, and there's all this light, so I can't see any of you, which is very strange. But as we said in the introduction, we are architects who are trying to design places for people. And we try very hard to make our architecture an architecture of humanism. There's an old Chinese proverb that goes, "May you live in interesting times." And it sounds like a nice thing to say to people, but actually it's a curse. And I think in that Chinese sense, we live in very interesting times when it comes to architecture at this point. There's a huge debate raging between the modernists and the non-modernists. And it's very interesting. I think that the modernists take their architecture as a religion and believe that anything that is contrary to that religion is heretical. There are many of us who believe in a slightly different world. We believe that the measure of buildings is not how they think, but rather how they feel. And that the appropriate attachment to a building is an emotional one rather than an intellectual one. And that in the end, what's important is that we create places people love, not places that people think fondly of. And that's very much the purpose to our architecture. It's to create places for people. We believe that architecture can bring people together. We believe that architecture can create community. We also believe that architecture can do the reverse. It can divide people, it can separate them, and it can make it more difficult for groups of diverse people to come together and learn to understand one another. We believe in pedestrianism, we believe in the appropriate use of the automobile, and we believe in a very, very deep and extensive understanding of history. There's a very prominent critic in this city who has tended to dismiss the importance of history and would lead you all to believe that modernism is something that sprang from whole cloth. And what I intend to do in this lecture is show you the roots of architectural style and try to explain to you how all of us sitting in this room are really the result of 3,500 years of architectural history and tradition. And that what is built today and what we see and understand today is very much a result of that too, be it my work or the work of Frank Gehry, Daniel Libeskind, or any of the cutting edge architects. Can we turn the lights down? Maybe. Well, actually, it's the spotlight I'd really like to get rid of. Actually, can we turn the spotlight off? Much better. Actually, even lower would be even better. My screen isn't going to look too good. I think we're almost there. That's great, thank you. It's important to understand that architecture has been an issue of fantasy and imagination forever. It's really interesting to look at this painting by Thomas Cole. It was painted in 1840 that talks about the architect's dream. And what he views as the architect's dream in this painting is a series of very important buildings from history, and he assembles them to make a new place. We can see Karnak, we can see things from ancient Greece, we can see a fair amount of Romanesque architecture. And it's interesting to note that in 1840, the notion of what architects ought to be dreaming all found their roots in history. We find our roots of design in history as well. And you can see in this development of product that George Jetson's telephone from the 1960s has become real in 2001. And Dick Tracy's two-way radio is something you can now purchase. Motorola and Chris Galvin will tell you that the model for Star Trek's flip phone, Motorola's flip phone, was Star Trek's communicator. It's really very interesting to note how all sorts of culture informs what we design and what we understand as design. It's very hard to believe that the folks in Skidmore and Owings and Merrill weren't reading weird science when they were kids. The similarity between this drawing from 1953 and this building from 1963 is truly remarkable. And it may not have been an active borrow, but clearly this building impressed somebody's subconscious significantly. Frank Gehry was polite enough to tell us how he designed this building after. It's named the Fred and Ginger building, and it's in Prague. And we can see in this picture from Top Hat of Fred and Ginger that he really wasn't kidding. That really, in effect, this building does capture Fred and Ginger's massing. It really does relate to their massing in detail. So we all choose to borrow from somewhere. The question is where and how, and what we do with it. I want to take you through a little bit of history and show you how architectural history informs how and what we build. And then I want to show you how that has affected my work and my office's work. It's important that you understand that my office's work is the work of 40 people. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of leading those 40 people, but it is a team effort, and every one of those people contributes significantly to the work my office produces. If you look at this continuum of neoclassical architecture and look at its early beginnings in the Acropolis, we can see how that progresses into the 2nd century BC and then the 2nd century AD in the Temple of Hera. We can trace this through Renaissance Italy, to Michelangelo, to England with Indigo Jones, and to the Palais du Louvre in Paris. We can see that this continuum stretches for over 2,000 years. And actually was imported to the United States as well. We can see in Peter Harrison's church in Boston the importation to the United States quite early on. And likewise, we can see the classical style rendered in a more American material in Charles Bulfinch's State House in Massachusetts. We can see this carried to New York and Mead McKim White's library, to Boston and Mead McKim White's library, and then look at John Russell Pope's building for the National Archives. It's interesting because we can see this style adapted to the time and manners of the day. In more recent times, Robert Venturi, for his mother, really began to abstract neoclassical architecture to the utmost. This was the more is a bore rather than, and less is more syndrome. We can see what John Tittman did with neoclassical architecture effectively 15 years later. And then another 5 years after that, and 10 years after that, what Robert Orr did in returning to more truly clear neoclassical roots, and Alan Greenberg in this newspaper headquarters building. It's important to note that ideas are imported as well, and that the notions and forms can both be borrowed. Richard Meyer, when he presents the Getty Center, does talk about his inspiration as being the Acropolis. And when Leon Creer presented this project Atlantis, he uses basically the same pair of slides I'm showing you today. It's clear that Andre Palladio was extremely familiar with the Pantheon when he designed the Villa Rotunda, one of the finest early Italian Renaissance villas. The plans are similar, the detailing is similar. It's perfectly clear that he was very aware of precedent. These two buildings are about 400 miles apart. Likewise, it's interesting to look how the caryatides have been used over time. On the slide on the left is obviously from the Acropolis. St. Pancras Church is in London and was built in the early part of the 19th century. And in the interwar period in England and London as well, they were borrowed again for the High Point Apartments to form the entrance to the portico. It's quite clear that Frank Ford was aware of the Temple of Athena when he designed his submission for the competition to the Chicago Tribune building. And likewise, that Bob Stern was aware of both buildings when he designed the Brooklyn Law School. It's interesting to watch these progressions of history and how these buildings are adapted over time. It's also happened with other parts of neoclassical architecture as well. We can look at the Maison Carrée from 20 BC, look how it translates into Thomas Jefferson's Virginia State House, and then 300 years later, how Alan Greenberg borrows it yet once more. So here again, we have 2,000 years of architectural history reflected in buildings that are very, very common. This is not just true of neoclassical architecture. The notion of architectural inspiration is one that runs throughout the various styles of architecture, from the purely Western ones, what we know like Romanesque architecture. And you can see how in very diverse parts of Europe at a similar time, there was a real blossoming of Romanesque architecture. And again, this Romanesque architecture was imported to the United States. We can see in H.H. Richardson City Hall in Albany, or the old post office in Washington, D.C., the beginnings of the original part of this translation to the United States. We can see that that was translated into the government printing office in Washington, D.C., and then again how Hartman Cox took that same style of architecture and 100 years later incorporated it into a new, more modern building. It's interesting to look at how these things evolve. These are three very different Romanesque buildings from very different times. And it's clear that we would all look at Durham Cathedral and recognize it as a Romanesque building. Likewise, we can see the inspiration in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and see how it drew heavily on this notion of the Romanesque church. What's particularly interesting is to look at Cesar Pelli's building for National Airport, where we have the same truss work at the edges of the domes, the same oculists in the centers of the dome. And what really emerges here is a change in style, but not a fundamental change in architecture. In our own work, when we went to design this building on Connecticut Avenue, our inspiration was Trinity Church. I'll talk more about that later. Again, in Gothic architecture, the same story is true. The first Gothic building was a building called, a cathedral called Saint-Denis, which was designed by Abbot Suger in 1150. And it derived from his notion that a church ought to be a place that had the appropriate light for contemplation. And the notion was to create a wall that was quite glassy and bring into that environment a kind of light that was appropriate for the glorification of God. We can see that perfected in Notre Dame very shortly thereafter, basically 100 years later when this building was finished. And we can see it imported to Germany in the Cologne Cathedral, basically at the same period. Westminster Abbey, basically 300 years later, took the Gothic style to England, which is extremely important because taking the Gothic style to England created College Gothic, something that many of us are quite familiar with. College Gothic was basically invented because the finest religions in the early days were church-related. What happened was people were educated by monks. So the Gothic style was equated with the finest educations. And when Princeton went to build their campus, they decided that they were really interested in reflecting Queens College. And when Yale went to build its new college system by James Gamble Rogers, we can see how carefully they looked at Oxford. It's very interesting to see how the ideology behind these buildings and the style behind these buildings translates over thousands of years and communicates the same information. We can see how these have been brought into current times since Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's building at Washington University, which is one take on College Gothic, or Dimitri Porphyrios' building at Magdalen College at Oxford. On the lower building, you can see how we reinterpreted College Gothic for our building at Yale University, which was finished a little under a year ago. Again, we can see that style can be abstracted and turned into whole buildings. It's very interesting to look at Cass Gilbert's submission or final winning entry for the Woolworth building. Clearly, he was familiar with Ulm Cathedral, which was built in the 14th century. It's interesting that this cathedral to commerce, very shortly thereafter, basically 10 years, became converted in Pittsburgh to a cathedral of learning, and is part of a great university there. And what's really particularly interesting is to see how Philip Johnson then abstracted that form to the utmost and created the PPG building, using only the slightest flourishes to bring you back to the Gothic style. Yet when we look at the PPG building, we fully understand its precedent, and we fully understand what generated the ideas behind that building. Again, we can see how those ideas are incorporated into buildings over a great deal of time. These two buildings are 400 years apart. This is the ceiling in King's College Chapel. This is the ceiling of a modernista building in Barcelona called the Palais de Música de Catalunya. Yet these buildings are in form and everything but the smallest or decorative details, the same building and the same space. It's interesting to watch this carried forward in other kinds of places and carried to the modern time. If we look at this 14th century cathedral, we can see how Gaudi stole from it when he created this building at the very end of the 19th century. What's even more interesting is to look at how Calatrava adapted the exact same form in his colonnade in Toronto. So again, we can see the continuum of architectural style. And what's important about these images is that not only can we see the continuum of architectural style, we can see a cathedral rendered as a school and then rendered as a large public space in various styles and quite modern. What's really interesting is this is true of regional architecture as well. It's not true of the universals or the styles that have become universal, like neoclassical, Gothic, and the like. If you look at this 14th century mosque, we can see how this mosque became the 15th century centers in Seville. We can see how Spanish architecture, Spanish Moorish architecture, was really taken from early Muslim architecture. What's particularly interesting then is to see how that got translated 400 years later in Toledo, and how that style really began to emerge in Spain. What's particularly interesting then is to see how that informed the modernistas in Barcelona at the turn of the 20th century. And these buildings by Gaudi and by Montagnier looked absolutely radical when they were built, but they looked radical because of what they were built next to. They didn't look radical because they didn't partake in the history of the country. They do clearly partake in the history of country, and they are part of the continuum of the architectural heritage of the place in which they exist. Again, if we look at this staircase from the Alhambra and look at the staircase that Antonio Gaudi designed for the Park Güell, we can see that effectively all that Gaudi has done is added tile to a pre-existing form and added color. Again, when we look at Jean Nouvel's sun control devices for the Arab Institute in Paris, we can see that he was very interested in Arab motifs and borrowed from ones that he knew to create his irises that modulated the light. And we can see that he was interested in creating the same kind of light that one got in the Arab architecture with his irises, and getting a very soft, highlighting, dappling light, very much like one would find in one of the Arab countries. It's interesting to take these kinds of precedents and see, again, how they're carried into modern times. If we look at Gaudi's Casa Batlló in Barcelona as well, and look at the Valencia Opera House by Santiago, it's important to remember, by Santiago de Calatrava, it's important to remember that Calatrava is a Spanish architect as well. We can see that these forms have a very early precedent. If we look at the ceiling from the Casa Mila and look at this ceiling from Bilbao, we can see that Frank Gehry had studied his Spanish architecture as well very carefully before he went to design in Spain. It's interesting to note that even exotic architectures, like Japanese architecture, have been incorporated into the modern ethos and have been brought forward to inform us today. These are all 16th and 17th century Japanese buildings. And we can see in some of the castles and in some of the houses the beginnings of the origin of what is the Japanese architecture. It's important to remember that the Orient wasn't open to Westerners until the 1850s. So this influence was not imported to Europe and America until quite late. But it's important to understand that it was in fact imported. If we look at this 17th century house and look at Frank Lloyd Wright's interior for the Unity Temple, it's very interesting to note the similarities in the way the ceilings are handled, the way light enters at the top, and the way the screens at the back are handled. It's perfectly clear that when Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Kunli House, he was very, very familiar with some of the ceremonial shrines built in Japan 500 years, 400 years previous to that. Again, it's very hard to believe that Mies van der Rohe wasn't well versed in Japanese architecture. When we look at the Barcelona Pavilion in 1928, which was considered revolutionary at the time it was designed, and look as well at the 17th century temple in the slide to the left of it, these buildings are the same in concept. I mean, there is no difference. And likewise, if we look at the eastern wall of the shrine on the left-hand slide and look at the very famous building, the Farnsborough House, we can see that these buildings, again, are absolutely the same in what goes to make them. Heavy roof, recessed base. I mean, they are from the same notion. So our modernists were heavily inspired by an architecture of a different place and a different time. Even people who were considered as radical as Peter Eisenman were borrowing heavily as well. If we look again at this 17th century Japanese building and the layering of planes and the different kinds of verticals and horizontals, and look at Eisenman's house too, we can begin to understand the origins of his architecture. What's particularly interesting is to look at what he built when he was building in Tokyo, when his career was more mature. What he did was to take these same sorts of grids and begin to erode them and shift them. The inspiration comes here, but what happens is a twisting, is something to deconstruct, if you will, the grids. This was the beginning of the period of deconstructivism in architecture, by the by. Some of us think that was a great tragedy. Some of you may not, but anyway, that's my opinion. But it's interesting to note that modern architecture really resulted out of the real chaos that generated the First World War. Society was in upheaval. There was huge amounts of tension in Europe. Everybody wanted something new. Everybody wanted something different. Everybody wanted a break from the past. And the result was that we got a whole bunch of futurisms, or isms, if you will. One of them was Italian futurism. Another was Russian constructivism. These occurred all over Europe. And what happened was, during the interwar period, these things got resolved into the Bauhaus. The movements came together, people started to talk to each other, and we were trying to move out of an imperial Europe. We were trying to move out of a Europe basically that was steeped in the traditions of emperors and kings, and really trying to move to the people and democracies. And we can see the international style become pure in this Corbusier building, Unité de Habitation, in which buildings became machines for people, which was a phrase that was coined after World War II to talk about mass-producing housing for the people. And we can see it all over New York. There are lots of things that in this very city derive from this self-same notion. It's important to understand that modernism originally was a very small style. It didn't occur in big pieces, as we've grown to understand it in this city today. It was things like trees that provided scale. It was things like spiral staircases that told you how big people were. It was things like window mullions. So what happened was the origins of modern architecture were really about keeping buildings in scale with people and putting an object in the environment where the environment mediated between people and the object. And this is how modernism was imported to the United States. We can see this in the Lovell Beach House, which is probably one of the most famous early modern buildings in the US, or for that matter, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. The first person to begin to abstract modernism in the United States and begin to turn it into office buildings is this very famous building by Howe and Lescaz, the PSFS building, which was designed in 1929 and finished being built in 1932. It was finished right before, this was built during the Depression. This was a very inexpensive way of building at the time. It's very clear that Skidmore, Owings & Merrill was very familiar with the PSFS building when they built the Lever House in New York, which just recently finished being restored. And the Lever House looks much less radical when you look at it next to PFSS. It's also interesting to see how Louis Kahn then took modernism and adapted it to the materials of Phillips Exeter Academy, and how the same curtain wall is rendered in brick, which is much more the materials of Exeter. And then once again, Richard Meyer in the High Museum translates the curtain wall in modernism yet one more time. And what the skin becomes is a piece of sculpture. It becomes something to create form rather than simply enclose space. And this is where architecture begins to become the sculpture in itself. And this is where, this in the Guggenheim, is where museums begin to become more about the building, or as much about the building as they do about the art. But again, even modernism has its roots in classicism. Many people would consider Friedrich Schinkel to be the first modern architect. We can see in the Altes Museum a very stripped down form of classicism. And this was built in the beginning part of the 18th century. There is a glass curtain wall behind these columns. It's interesting to look at how Dulles Airport really is inspired by the Altes Museum. We can see the rhythm of columns, the heavy cornice, the glass wall, and the base. And clearly, Calatrava was quite familiar with both of these buildings when he designed the Lucerne train station. This is true of details as well. If we look at the Temple of Karnak from 1350 BC, and look at Antonio Gaudi's columns in the colonnade in the Park Güell, we can see that, again, what looked revolutionary out of context looks like a direct ripoff from something that was designed almost 3,500 years before. And likewise, if we look at Frank Lloyd Wright's Johnson Wax building, what again looked revolutionary at the time it was designed is really part of 3,500 years of architectural history. These slides could be continuous. I could give you these images every century, but they only gave me 45 minutes, and I think I risk running over that anyway, so I'm abbreviating to a degree. It's very, very interesting to see how a style that is as pure and as at the time unique as Japanese traditional architecture was, is translated again in Unity Temple. And we can see how the detailing on both these buildings really are inspired by one another. We can also see another take on the same architecture in the De Stijl period in Europe of approximately the same time that Wright was working. And it's very easy to see the relationship between these two architectures. Again, looking at Peter Eisenman's work, it's interesting to see how he took these grids and these highly delineated kinds of spaces and created what, again, was a new architecture in House 4. It's very interesting to look at these two buildings. If one looks at Paul Rudolph's building for the School of Art and Architecture at Yale and the Larkin building by Frank Lloyd Wright, we can see that these buildings are almost identical both in plan and elevation. See that the core is removed from the block of the building. The core is removed from the block of the building. They are both designed around a large central space. They're both designed around a large central space. On the floor above this, there is a bridge at Yale here, and there is a bridge here. Both buildings have glassy centers and very solid, very heavy masonry corners. So what, again, if you looked at out of historical context, you look at in historical context, it really becomes a direct result of earlier architecture. And if you don't find these two slides compelling, you certainly will these two. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water and Paul Rudolph's house for Sid Bass. It's very interesting to look at these two slides together, and one can't help but wonder whether Rudolph had on his desk some of the pictures of falling water as he was designing Mr. Bass's house. I mean, the similarities are absolutely striking. Fantasy architecture has always been a part of architecture. We talked about a fantasy that was painted by Thomas Cole in 1840. We can also see some other fantasies, one by Ledoux in 1775 and another by Boulez in 1784. One of the interesting things about modern times is that we have chosen to build fantasy architecture. And what was meant to be drawings to cause people to think and entertain in the World's Fair in New York started to become real. We decided that our fantasies were well worth building. And it's quite clear that when Rodgers and Piano designed their Pompidou Center in Paris, that they were very aware of the New York 1934 World's Fair. It's very interesting to look at the House of Tomorrow from that World's Fair and look at the Pompidou Center. Again, we begin to understand that it isn't so much whether things are original or not, it depends on how scholarly the architect is. One of the things I found very interesting about some of the New York critics is I think one of the reasons they think things are original is because they're not particularly scholarly. They simply don't understand that everybody copies. They don't take the time to do their research. It's interesting, again, to see how this continues to be true from, the 1934 World's Fair in this bridge from that World's Fair, and to look at Calatrava's bridge, and to look at Foster's bridge. At least the bridge in the 1934 World's Fair worked. People could walk across it. I'm sure that most of you know that the bridge, the Tate Modern, has not been open since it was finished. Again, looking at World's Fair architecture, Moshe Safdie was clearly aware of what the Hopis used to build. And what's particularly interesting about Safdie's work is that the Japanese chose to borrow from it as well to build this capsule building in Tokyo. This is one of those places that if you're a Japanese businessman and it's a 3.5-hour commute to your house and your office in downtown Tokyo, you go get your 4x4x10 cube and spend the night. But it's interesting to see how they're modular and become stacked up. What's really interesting to understand how culture affects architecture and how culture generates architecture. It's interesting that the Jetsons were started as a cartoon strip at the same time that the theme building for LAX was designed. These buildings came from the same ethos in American society at that time. A real belief in the future, a real belief that the future would be different, a real belief that the future would be better. What's particularly interesting is that belief is still prevalent in Las Vegas today. It's interesting to note this building that was just finished in 1996. Most of us have given up on this notion, but in Las Vegas, they still believe. When you look at Archigram's work in 1964, or Paulo Soleri's work in 1974, it's again hard to believe that as kids, they weren't reading weird science. I just chose one of the images from the magazine, but if you look at the comic book architecture from the early to mid-50s, and you look at what people started to generate as an architecture, again, the question of scholarship is how creative and how good you are at doing your research. Many of these architects are incredibly creative in where they get their inspiration. We can see themes running through long periods of time, even if they're potentially mythical, from all of the renderings of the Tower of Babel to Antonio Gaudí at the turn of the century in Barcelona, to the monument to the Third Communist International by Tatlin, the Tatlin Tower, Philip Johnson in Dallas and Thanksgiving Chapel, and Hardy Obado and Kasselbaum in the headquarters church building. So here again, we understand that these ideas and forms are not unique. And while the buildings may look somewhat different, they're the same idea rendered in different styles. Again, the question of whether what is considered to be edge architecture today is a question of how well you do your research, of how well you understand the origins of the people at whom you're looking. We can see a building by Frank Gehry, a building by Daniel Libeskind, a building by Stephen Hall, and a building by I.M. Pei. All of these are embraced by many of the critics across the United States to be as being the future of architecture. Some of us find the notion of our cities looking like this as terrifying. I'm amongst that crowd. But again, it's important to understand there is historical precedent for this. You might think it was just crumpling up a piece of paper and throwing it in your wastebasket, but actually it does have some precedent in buildings. And again, people shouldn't understand architects or underestimate architects, and they really should look at the kind of scholarship that the architects probably were looking at. If we look at this Mendelssohn drawing from 1914 and look at how Nervi took the same forms and began to build them as technology permitted, and then look at Saarinen Dulles Airport, which we can see begins to become the exact same building, and then look how Calatrava again dealt with the same forms in the Lucerne train station, we can understand that what has changed is not the idea of architecture, but rather the abilities of technology. And what has happened is we have become able to build things that we used to be only able to draw. What Frank Gehry deserves a huge amount of credit for is developing a computer program that will cut steel in any shape he can draw, so that he can take his drawings, put them in a computer, send them off to a mill, and make the buildings he makes. So this is really much more the result of technology than it is the result of a unique design. Again, if we look at Finsterland's design for a technical school at the turn of the century, and look at the design of the Sydney Opera House, the Sydney Opera House looks far less revolutionary than it did when we first saw it on the skyline in Sydney. Again, if we look at this Kiesler House from 1960, and look at the ideas that generated the museum in Bilbao, we can again see the ideas are borrowed. The notion of ribbons, the notion of plastic forms, the notion of agglomerating plastic forms and ribbons to create a building is one that started long before Frank Gehry did it at Bilbao. You know, it used to be that we enjoyed our cartoons and believed them as cartoons. It used to be that we would leave them on the page and enjoy them as fantasies, and in the 60s, that's what we did. It's really interesting to note that what used to be our cartoons have become very serious proposals for how to replace the World Trade Center in downtown Lower Manhattan. This is a real shift in what we choose to copy from, or what we choose for inspiration. At one point in time, it was considered best to ape high culture. Now we're really quite prepared to ape any culture. But the important part of this lecture is to really drive home to all of you that we all look back in order to create our future. And that really is the nature of architecture. The nature of architecture is to understand our history, understand our traditions, and from where we come, to create something that is a slightly different take on those things that we make today. I want to show you a little bit about how those things have affected my office and our work. I'm basically going to show you our public projects and neither our office buildings nor our houses, because I think it's really important to talk about this notion of places for people. I contradict myself immediately. The first building I'm going to show you is one of our office buildings. This was the first building to be built in Washington, D.C. under the new Historic Preservation Code. This building was designed in 1978. As I told you earlier in this lecture, this building's inspiration was Trinity Church. You can see the three openings, the center, major center opening, the 5 over 1, the 5 over 1, the 2 over 1, the 2 over 1, breaking the cornice line with a series of gables, breaking the cornice line with a series of gables, a large center mass rising above, a large center mass rising above. You can also see that we borrowed heavily from the buildings on either side. You can see that our windows are casement windows like the building to the left, and you can see that they're round-headed casements being taken from the building to the north. You can see that our cornice line is close to this cornice line, and that our building height line matches the building height line here. We also borrowed our details freely. And what we tried to do was to learn from history to create something that was entirely new, that was very much as some of the stuff you've seen before. This chimney detail from a Frank Furness house outside Philadelphia, the detail on our tower, a detail from Frank Furness's train station in Philadelphia, our center arch. Again, we wanted to design all four sides of the building. We spent so much money on the front that we didn't have any money left for the back. At the time I was teaching, and one of my students asked me where they could see a Corbusier-type international style building in Washington. I thought about it for a couple of minutes, and I said, you know, I don't think you can. And we were working on this building. I said, oh, that's a great idea. It's really inexpensive. Let's do that. So you can see the columns and our columns, the pilotis and our pilotis, ribbon windows interrupted by verticals, the ribbon window spaces interrupted by verticals, the curve and the curve. So what I tried to do was, do something for myself. And this is actually a view down the alley. You really, or down a gap to the alley. I really wanted to do something so the next time I was teaching this particular course, it would be easier. And I could say, oh, just go in the alley and look. Another building we did at 1818 N Street was a different kind of contextual problem, and as such, found its sources elsewhere. The two sides on the left show a row of historic houses, which we were asked to insert a building behind. You can see in the lower slide here that we managed to build a quite large building and hide its mass, which permitted us to preserve the massing of the buildings below. This slide is taken from the 4th story of the building that's catty corner, and you can see the building begin to reveal itself. However, when we chose to have the building reveal itself on the street, what we did was we borrowed heavily from the Glasgow School of Art. You can see how our gable form matches their gable form, how our use of a glass bay is mirrored by their use of a glass bay, and how basically our punched windows at the base of that glass bay reflect their punched windows at the base of the glass bay. Yet the buildings look quite different. Again, you can see how we carried these same notions through in these glass corners into the setback portion of the building. Another place where we referenced buildings and really were very interested in context is Children's Hospital in Fort Worth. Children's Hospital was the merging of 2 other previously existing institutions, these 2 buildings. And we decided that we really needed to do something that united those 2 buildings in some fashion. It was also very important to the Board of Trustees that this building reflect history and permanence, because the first day of this institution was the first day this building opened. And they wanted parents to have a real faith and belief in the new institution. So you can see the limestone in this building becomes the limestone in our building. The brick in this building becomes the brick in our building. And stylistically, you can look at the Bethesda Naval Hospital for a great deal of our stylistic information. And also, this building was built as an apartment hotel in Washington, D.C. The patient tower of a hospital building is very little more than a hotel with very extensive services and very expensive services. That building is designed around a central courtyard. This is effectively another what is supposed to be exterior facade. Obviously, it's an interior. And you can see that all that is really built of the towers is a quarter of them, and 3/4 of them are reflected in the mirror glass walls. And what happens is you go up in the atrium, the mirror glass reflects these corner towers ad infinitum, and you get a soundscape that goes on and on and on and on and on. The important part about this space is there are some children who spend their whole lives in this building. They are born in this hospital, and they end their lives here. So to have a space that was an outdoor space for them and to have a space that was playful for them was very important. The same notion is carried through to the smallest details, where wayfinding becomes banners and decoration, where the color for coding patient rooms becomes friezes and cornices, where the signs that are usually carelessly pasted on the door become a house form, where the patient, if they're well enough and old enough, gets to write their own name so they have some ownership in the house. Some ownership in the room. And for those patients who aren't so old or can't read, a pictogram was developed in order to tell them something about where they were going. In another office building, our inspiration came differently. This is the office my office used to be in. We then discovered we couldn't afford our own work and had to move. But it sits next to a Category 1 historic landmark. The Mayflower Hotel used to be the place where the presidential inaugural ball will happen. Many of you may have been to inaugural balls before, and there are now 9 of them. It's hard to believe there was really a time when there was only 1. But it was such a time. And for our building, we looked at neoclassical office buildings as they exist in Washington. We looked at the Mayflower Hotel and how it was designed in its base, shaft, capital. We looked at the building across the street and how they dealt with curves. We also looked at the streetscape just north of us and looked how it began to step down to a very low scale. So we took our building and we took our belt course at this level from our next door neighbor. We took our base column capital divisions from the Mayflower, our material choices from the Mayflower, and used the neoclassical orders very much like this building. So what you can see we did is we combined a very, very diverse set of architectural forces to create a new architecture that solved the particular problems for this particular site. Our entrance to the office building was inspired by this gate by Indigo Jones into a cemetery. And likewise, our canopy came from a department store built in Washington at the turn of the century. Hugely diverse inspirations that really can be put into a unified whole. As you walk into this building, the same notion, the same neoclassical notion, and modernizing it, making it reduced, making it abstract, takes you into the building, to the reception desk, and turns you into the elevator lobby. We're probably most famous for the ballpark in Arlington, and the reason for this is that the New York Times once said this made our current president president. He was the client for this. This was a competition which we were fortunate enough to win. The context for this building was a place called Arlington, Texas, one of the places that originated the statement, "There is no there." And you can see that this is your traditional suburban sprawl. And this was the stadium for the Rangers beforehand, which was originally built as a minor league stadium and enlarged. We looked at the history of Texas architecture because this team is the Texas Rangers, not the Dallas Rangers, not the Arlington Rangers, not the Fort Worth Rangers. And it was very important that our building take from that tradition. We also looked at the tradition of baseball architecture and tried to incorporate that into our building as well, so that we were continuing the traditions of baseball. Our glazing details, though, are quite modern. You can see our glass curtain wall and the press box. And what we chose to do here was to use the appropriate kind of style for the appropriate portions of buildings. And how we used elements of Texas history for decoration in our trusses, and how graphics became decoration as well, and how we used elements of baseball to be things such as the brackets for our signs and baseballs to be the medallions, and how we used artwork to talk about the names of our suites. The staircases in the building were Michelangelo's Laurentian Library, and you can see how our home run porch comes from Tiger Stadium. When we went to do another sports complex for the Walt Disney Companies, we looked to Florida Picturesque because we wanted to create a building and a place that was uniquely Floridian. And you can see how what we were able to do was to translate that architecture into a sports architecture of our time and be very referential to the kinds of spaces that exist in traditional, both Spanish and Florida Picturesque architecture, and translate that into a new use and a new style. Even to the point of looking at their lights. And what's particularly interesting is to note how even structure and things like trellises can be drawn from diverse places to become a new architecture. I showed you this building in the earlier presentation as well. This is the new Environmental Sciences building at Yale University, and our take on College Gothic. Science Hill had become a series of 50s and 60s buildings. In 1850, Yale University decided that science was really not a part of a liberal arts education. So they moved the sciences out of the main campus to what is now Science Hill. Since then, Yale has decided, yes, in fact, sciences are a part of a liberal arts education. And this project was the last opportunity to reincorporate Science Hill into the rest of the campus. And you can see we took our inspiration from the College Gothic colleges, from the old campus and their brick and brownstone, and from the College of Graduate Studies, which is an all-brick neo-Gothic building. And these were our two neighbors. This is our building. And what we chose to do was to enclose a piece of space, very much like the rest of the Yale campus encloses space, and to build a wall symmetrically to the wall of the other buildings around the central axis of Hill House Avenue, a street that de Tocqueville referred to as the most beautiful street in America. This is that building, and we wanted the same sort of richness that one got in a stone building but couldn't afford stone. And you can see how the facade changes in the play of light. And this was accomplished by using an iron spot header and a Flemish bond so that the building reflects light differently at different times of day and when it's cloudy and sunny. Yet the interior of this building talks about what's done in it. It's quite modern. And it talks about the sciences being a forward-looking thing. Also, this is an environmental sciences building, so it was supposed to be as green as possible. And what we did was to slice through the building to create this light shaft and create a series of offices for the collection management that really gave them light and gave them a view onto the main streets of this building so that they weren't isolated in windowless offices. A different kind of looking around us to understand what to design was our renovation for the Cleveland Orchestra in Cleveland, Ohio. What happened here was the original building is what we looked at for our inspiration. This was a much loved, again, Category 1 landmark in Cleveland. And our job was to build 40,000 new square feet, gut and restore 40,000 square feet, and restore 40,000 square feet. This is our new facade, and you can see how it borrows from the original building, but yet it's different. The slide on the left is the original column capitals from Severance. The slide on the right is ours. And you can see it's derived from an inverted treble clef and an organ keyboard. It really tries to talk about what the building does. Again, the front of this building became the back, and the back became the front because the orchestra built a parking garage behind the building. So what was a back of house corridor became the front of house corridor. And you arrived here and walked down this corridor. This is our new arrival point and the new corridor. There are two of these. There was one of these. In 1958, George Zell commissioned a new shell. This is what he thought it ought to look like. In 1998, we designed a new shell, and this is what we thought it ought to look like. We thought the shell ought to be the most celebratory thing, and what houses the orchestra should be the main event. We also do a lot of town planning, and this is one of the towns we're currently working on. And the same notion of borrowing from history and learning from the past can be taken into town planning. You know, the invention of the mall is one of the things that is of questionable utility in America today. And so what we did was to take a very traditional view of town planning, organized our town around a series of parks, these town squares, this much larger Olmstedian Park, and our water park, and created very real streets. The streets on the left are in Fort Worth, Texas, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and another picture of Fort Worth. The slide on the right was 2 days before South Lake opened. There are 12 national stores in this development. 6 of them have their highest dollar per square volume stores anywhere in the United States in this development. And this is truly in the middle of nowhere. You can see, looking across the park, what this looks like. We gave each of our store owners a unique architecture to express their personality and give them an individuality. And we were also hired by the city to do a new town hall, which we drew from the history of Texas civic buildings. Texas built a lot of city halls and courthouses at the turn of the century, and this is 3 of the better ones. And we did the same thing with our town hall and courthouse and fronted it onto the square. And really tried to create a great civic building that faced on a great civic space. On the left, you see the courtroom. On the middle and the bottom, you see the main lobby. And on the right, you see the council chambers. Our most recently finished building is the new arena in Dallas. And this building was important that an arena be a civic building rather than simply a machine that mints money for sports teams. So we tried to create a building that really, again, drew from the history of architecture. The first thing we looked at was the second Madison Square Garden, which was designed by McKim, Mead, and White. And we can see the tower form, which we borrowed from as well. But this building was quite small compared to what we have to design. So we began looking at a precedent like the Helsinki train station by Saarinen the Elder. And you can see how we translated that precedent and its stepped brick and our stepped brick and its arched forms, their canopy and our canopy, into, again, a new architecture. Their curtain wall and our curtain wall are quite different. Our skin is much taller than theirs. But again, as I say, we wanted it to be an important civic building, have wonderful public spaces. Slide on the left is the ceremonial entrance. What you do is you enter this space, then you walk into a rotunda. You can see the floor of the rotunda right here. And if you look up, that's what you see. And this is a turning moment that begins to twist you because we always want you to know where you are. The next place you get to is this staircase that combines all the premium levels and is another marking point in the path. You then come to another one of these rotundas and then enter into this next great room, all of which have windows, all of which orient you with natural light. And again, you can see how we looked at field houses and train stations to design our structure. And really, we're very aware of how people used to make beautiful structure. The last project I'm going to show you this evening is the Nancy Lee and Perry R. Bass Performance Hall in Fort Worth. And the reason for showing you this is because it really begins to talk about how very diverse architectures can be combined to create a unified whole and create a new architecture. We borrowed from neoclassical buildings like the Budapest Opera House, and you can see our arches and their arches. We looked at the concert hall in Prague and their use of sculpture and their use of square and roundhead windows, square and roundhead windows. We were very interested in Otto Wagner's work from Vienna, his heraldic angels, and you probably can just make out the metal buttons on this building, and you could probably, I hope, just make out the metal buttons on our building. So basically, we took from many, many countries, hundreds of years of architecture to make our building. We looked at this building in Paris, which is the Théâtre Champs-Élysées, which, interesting enough, was designed by a sculptor and an artist rather than an architect, and reformed their corner entrances to become our own. And yet translated that quite differently into an interior. You enter into this quarter dome center space, and you come to lobbies that have wonderful views and great vistas. And you can see that in our light fixtures, we became quite modern, as we did in our aircraft cable guardrails. For our paneling, we looked again to Wagner and borrowed heavily from what he did at the turn of the century in Vienna. And in doing the hall itself, we again looked at the Théâtre Champs-Élysées in Paris, using what they had learned about domes to inform what we learned about domes. They taught us that if you put a light fixture in the middle of what normally would be a focusing element, the dome can be inserted into the building without focusing sound and get a very good concert hall. Likewise, they taught us that ribs break up the dome as well. From the Opera House below, we learned that lighting adds sparkle, and that by bending your balcony fronts, you make sure that sound doesn't reflect in focus. What was interesting to us was that the concert halls of Europe from 1500 to 1900 all had marvelous acoustics. And we saw people struggle in New York with Lincoln Center and create buildings that really didn't do as well. And we figured that our architecture could ape their architecture, and thus our acoustics could ape their acoustics. This has been voted one of the 10 best concert halls in the world, so I think we probably succeeded. And I think the important point of this lecture is to hope that by saying things like these, we can herald a new piece of architecture and get people to be more considered in their thoughts and the way they look at architecture, and understand better that all of us are simply building on the shoulders of giants. Thank you. So I know you're all hot and tired, but if any of you do have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
We quite often go to the Philharmonic, that auditorium you mentioned, and the way in which they have had to put up baffles here and all sorts of tricks made me wonder, when did they consult an acoustic engineer as they were designing?
They did have an acoustic engineer throughout the design process. I think it's a situation where the acoustic engineer and the architect failed to serve their client well. That's a building that has intrinsic flaws and will never be able to be made into an acoustically superior hall unless you remove about half the seats.
Very small question. Do you know what the condition of Paul Rudolph's house for the best is?
Yes, it is perfectly preserved, perfectly maintained, and very well taken care of.
You didn't mention Art Deco as a distinct style among the others. Any particular reason for that?
The fact that I'm probably somewhat past my time as it is, and I couldn't be comprehensive. This is an encyclopedic view of architecture rather than a comprehensive one. I could have taken any of these styles and done a whole lecture on just that one.
David, I'd like to ask you a question about architects as people. You talked about building on the shoulders of giants. Let's say you do a building and you have built on the shoulder of a giant and you've copied what you used to capture.
Oh, we don't copy. We are inspired by. We quote. We reinterpret. We never copy.
I misunderstood. I thought you used the word copy.
I apologize. If I did, it was used in error.
So let's say you produce a building and it has been inspired by another architect's work. In secret circles in your industry, does one architect say, well, David Schwarz did something so brilliant with that other thing that was done by somebody else? Or do they say, oh, he just copied something or somebody else?
It depends on what it is. The ballpark in Arlington was finished, and a Ford dealership down the street decided to copy it and turn it into their dealership. It actually is a copy. That architect has been accused of copying. I don't know that Rudolph ever admitted his inspiration. The reason I know his work so well is I worked for him. And my last job for him was to do an exhibit of his work. And I got to go through his archives extensively. Mr. Rudolph never would have admitted to having seen another building by another architect anywhere in the world.
As we think about what to build in Lower Manhattan, what are the styles or elements that you think someone designing that should look at?
I think that's an extremely difficult question. Right after September 11th, I was interviewed by a television station in LA that asked me the same question. And my response to them was that I think a society that insists on building targets is a society with huge hubris. I think the question of what kind of a city we want New York to be and what kind of a place we want Lower Manhattan to be is probably a precedential question to what style it should be. Building buildings that hold 50,000 people is really not a particularly human thing to do. What it does to traffic and transportation, what it does to neighborhoods, and the dehumanization of trying to force that many people into such a small space to come and go is a notion that I think is certainly at least worth questioning. And I think we really ought to ask ourselves what kind of place we want New York to be. I worked here for 3 years and I love the city dearly. I spent a lot of time here. And I think that commercial architecture in New York really has, for a long time, been much less interested in serving the people than serving the needs of the people who live here.
Thanks very much. It was a very informative lecture. I surmise from what you say that there are people in your profession who don't agree, who see things otherwise. If one of them were to stand up here, or some kind of an aggregate of them in a person, what would they say? Well, I mean,
Oh, I can tell you what they've said. The Dallas Morning News and I have had an ongoing war, which has now, I think, been going on for almost 10 years since we won the ballpark in Arlington competition. They've been extraordinarily nasty to me. They refer to me as Disney-esque, lick and stick architecture, impure. The people at the University of Texas in Arlington view me as the devil incarnate. I am really held up as the example of everything that one shouldn't have in architecture. And when I gave a speech there, many of the professors lobbied, picketed, and insisted their students not go. And my saying that this has a notion of religious zealousness, I wasn't kidding. There are many circles in which I really am considered the worst thing that ever happened. But I hope I make places that you'd be happy to be. Yes?
Why do people consider your doors?
You know, I've never understood that. Intolerance is not something I understand. I think diversity and multiplicity of opinions really creates for a much richer world. It's interesting that we all champion diversity when it comes to civil rights, integration, different kinds of communities, but that your very own prominent architecture critic is so intolerant of people who have ideas other than his own and doesn't even deign to talk about us unless it's to insult us. Yes?
This was a most enlightening talk. I just wonder, what is done in architecture to anticipate possible future damage? Have in mind it was falling water, said the pyramid of the Louvre, more time is spent cleaning it and reinforcing it. Frank Gehry's French computer-generated skin is beginning to heal.
It's never worked, right. It's never worked. The Sans Arabique, the skin has never worked.
So there's a certain element of entropy, let's say.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's a street in Peking, which I saw when I was there. There is no word in Chinese for maintenance, which is a very interesting fact. And the Chinese took the same set of plans and built 2 buildings every year from 1951, and the last time I was there was in 1997, I think it was, maybe 96. And they built the same building going down the street. And you could watch what happened to this building as it decayed. The 1951 ones were really ruins, and the brand new ones were bright and shiny and looked great. How buildings work is in large measure a question of clients. In the case of Jean Nouvel, the fault lies with Mitterrand, who also commissioned a library where all the stacks were glass, and this was Mitterrand's request, where the library gets so hot and there's so much sunlight that you can't put any books in it. All the people were put in the basement and all the books were put with the glass. And this was Mitterrand. In many cases, it is the architect. In many cases, architect's hubris creates a celebration of the architect rather than a celebration of the use. And that can either be the architect or it can be the client. It's very hard in some cases to distinguish what. In the case of the Louvre, I think it's fascinating because I think the director of the Louvre was brilliant in getting that shopping center built, because what he really managed to do was to get $2 billion spent on his expansion space. Because we all know the shopping center is going to fail, and at some point it's going to be just turned into more of the Louvre, and he'll be able to show more of his collection. It was absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
David, what is the architectural style that you draw most inspiration from, and which is your favorite style?
I've been asked to typify my work many times before, and I've coined the phrase neo-eclectic for myself. There was a period of architecture of which Blenheim Palace is probably one of the best examples outside London, which was called eclecticism. And it really came after the Baroque, and what it really was a combining of all sorts of different styles. It's where Baroque impediments came from, and many other different sorts of things. Do I have a favorite style? Probably not. I think that style is one of the many tools available to an architect to solve a problem. To create a neoclassical ballpark would be an extremely odd thing to do. And likewise, I think there are many places where to use college Gothic ballpark, unless it was at Yale or Princeton or Harvard, or no, not Harvard, Harvard's brick. But so style to me is one of the very useful tools of communicating thoughts and communicating ideas and communicating intention. Yeah.
The buildings you've done at South Lake, is the intent of looking at your inspiration so that the buildings have that character in terms of age?
No.
To speak of the age that they're built in?
No, my office and I had a huge conversation about which slides to include of South Lake. There's some neo-rationalist buildings in South Lake as well, which we also designed. For us, the way we got South Lake to be unique is we created a series of teams in the office. And each team worked on a building, and they weren't allowed to talk to each other. I was the only person who knew what everybody else was doing because I didn't want all the buildings to come out the same. So basically what happened is we had teams throughout the office with different ideas, and I was involved in the generation of those ideas. But what was important to us about South Lake was that it read as if it happened over time rather than all at once, not that it happened at a time. Anybody else? Sorry for starting so late. It was my fault. I sat on the ground in Washington for 2 hours. I was afraid I wouldn't get here to talk to you, but I'm happy I did, and I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.